My name is Sam Cox. I'm the Vice President of Global Media at MediaMath, which means that I run about 50 different exchanges worldwide. That's about 200 billion impressions a day. A team that also runs 2,000 direct-to-publisher relationships, as well as data partners, and kind of anything that MediaMath touches that is not an ad falls into my remit. We also do social and native, so I'm happy to say that we have a group here that represents pretty much all the different parts of the ecosystem for digital media. I'll let them each introduce themselves. Why don't we start with you?
Sure. So I'm Lori Baker. I founded HuffPost Partner Studio and am now running all content sales for AOL.
Kevin Freed with Google. I manage the education team over at Google, and thank you for having us here, David. It's nice to see a bunch of familiar faces out in the audience, so looking forward to the conversation.
Chris Desi, founder and CEO of Silverback Social. We are a digital marketing firm based in White Plains, New York, social-first digital marketing firm.
Kevin Lee, co-founder of Did It 19 years ago. Mostly search marketing. About 60% of our revenue is search, organic, and paid. The remainder is other forms of earned media and display media as well. We're integrated into a couple of exchanges through DSPs.
Great. So I'm going to start with a question that's going to be for everyone, but then I'm going to try and avoid the round robin where we just keep going down the line, and I'd love it if we could make it a bit more conversational. I do have some questions that are going to be specifically to individuals on the panel, but let's start with one for everyone. So, does brand safety, especially from a compliance standpoint, impact publishers and advertisers differently? And if so, where do you sit on that spectrum, and how is it impacting you?
I think so. From a Huffington Post AOL perspective, I'm in the business of creating content with brands and for brands, publishing that content across my, the multiple sites. I think we look at it from a compliance perspective in 4 different ways. One, there's intellectual property that we have to be aware of, whether it's text, whether it's images. It is disclosure and transparency. So making sure that when a reader comes to engage with any piece of content, no matter where they are in the journey, is very transparent, that it's in partnership and or influenced and or paid for by a brand. The third piece I would say is advertising compliance, and I love that John spoke earlier about kind of like the B Corp side and getting to the why companies exist. So in the content space, because I have a journalistic kind of side, it's a real opportunity for brands to tell stories outside of product marketing and instead tell stories that are more conversational about why they exist, what value they provide. So from an advertising perspective, that's what we also focus on. And then last but not least, it's church and state. So making sure, making it very transparent with the clients that we work with that, our editors are not creating content for you, but we have a total separate team that sits on the business side of writers and journalists, but they are not editorial, nor do you influence any editorial side at any AOL property. And so from in a reader's perspective as well, again.
So at Google, I think we sit in an interesting place because we kind of sit right smack dab in the middle of all this. And we think about kind of regulation up top as it relates to education, but also compliance as it relates to advertising. And I think the thing we really think about and focus on is how do we utilize technology to really remove that as a barrier so that you could focus on some of the more strategic priorities as it relates to how you present your company out in the market. So we really do try to consider that. The other thing that we do is we always put the user first, right? And the formula is really simple, which is reach, relevancy, and ROI. And when you put the user at the middle of that and then you optimize that formula, the technology really just needs to work in the background. So now we're aware of all the very real legal constraints and things that are out there. So the technology has to be that good because it has to gain that high of a confidence level that the executives within the education companies can kind of let it go or move to the side and focus on what they consider to be some of the bigger issues that are out there. And that's kind of what's on our mind.
We try to avoid the round robin, but it's happening. So that's
This is the only question for everyone. This is the only one for everyone, I promise. I'll pick on each one of you individually in a bit.
From us, as an agency, we perhaps come at it from a different perspective because the trouble with social media tends to be social media. So when the clients come to us and say, I want to go viral, or our CEO wants to be a thought leader and wants to create all sorts of content, they're also asking us to generate the content, help guide the content, help drive everything appropriate to that brand's initiatives, goals, and of course, some sort of ROI, cha-ching, revenue at the end of that, in order for us to sort of keep them in line and understanding that everything that they're doing needs to be above board, transparent, and appropriate, and in line with, yes, their goals and objectives and their financial needs, but also in understanding the consumer and understanding the end user and having reverence for that. It's not such an easy thing. They're used to just saying, I want to pull the trigger, I want to pay you, just get it done and go there. And that tends to be a lovely friction that happens within our agency, but a sometimes painful discussion to bring up from the C-level suite, from brands that are just like, just do it, get it in front of people, and I don't care. We have to strike a kind of beautiful balance, and the way we've found to go around that from a social perspective is to rely heavily on the user-generated content that happens through social, so it's a little bit of a different perspective. So we're generating appropriate editorial from the C-suite, and we're creating brand content that is in line, but we're also bubbling up the user-generated content that's appropriate and still in line with the brand objectives. That made sense.
So in paid search marketing, and to a great extent in organic search marketing, there's a little bit of a pass with regards to sort of the brand safety issue as to sort of where is my ad going to be showing up? Is it going to be in a good neighborhood, bad neighborhood, that kind of thing. But given that the sort of broader umbrella for search marketing, particularly on the organic side, is brands as publishers, then you start to get situations where the same content is being used a lot of different ways, it's being promoted in a lot of different ways, and you start to get some of the disclosure issues that have been further amplified over the last couple of weeks with the Federal Trade Commission, clarifying. Most people have said that they haven't actually changed anything in their clarifications over the last couple of weeks, but a lot of people say there are some nuances to their changes that really do highlight transparency and disclosure with regards to, in particular, promoted content, both within the social context. But that might bleed over into the blogosphere pretty heavily as well. When brands are acting as publishers or syndicating content out, there's a bit of a gray zone there. The other thing, with some of the native advertising ad units, there's some fuzziness going on there with regards to is the advertorial style ads. Some of the native advertorial ads, it's not clear, where the Federal Trade Commission will come down on it. Obviously, there's a broader regulatory context if you do international that goes even beyond that. So those are just things to keep in mind because not every industry has the rule set completely cut and dry, and sometimes brands in the same industry will actually have a different interpretation of what those rule sets are. But within search, there are some industry-specific compliance issues for pharma, for EDU, et cetera, just within pure search that we have to think about.
I just wanted to add on to the end. It's not the end of the world when it comes to full-on compliance and about transparency as well for the content. When we have conversations with our brand partners who kind of want to sneak it behind the goalie, like, all right, this content needs to be seamless and completely like not feeling like an ad unit, but it's okay if there's quality content. I mean, like the Guinness Book of World Records, like Guinness did that, right? People are okay with it as long as the content is really good.
So you brought up an interesting point on the different verticals, but I'm gonna pick on AOL and Google here. Kind of, you distribute a lot of these ads, and you are the recipient of them, and your direct sales team, I'm sure, sells directly to them. So, for the two of you, how does brand safety and the legal things surrounding it impact your clients as the advertisers, and then what verticals are those clients in? And finally, kind of what are some of the key pain points that keep you up at night around those verticals and those clients? And I guess, Lori, we'll start with you. I mean, is it him? Is he the pain point, and are you worried about what he's doing? Or what are the verticals and pain points that actually keep you up?
Yeah, so in regards to brand safety, I think that we try to put as many stopgaps in place in regards to, like, an airline, for example. We do a lot with all the airlines, and obviously if there is a disaster or a crash, how do we, with our sophisticated targeting, because most likely they want to be around travel content, and a crash happens and that's tagged as travel, how do we, we have, tagging in place that allows us to negative keyword target. So we apply those a lot in just standard advertising. But in the native space where we kind of we do a lot of hand curation in my world. So when I'm working, for example, we work with Johnson & Johnson on a platform called Global Motherhood. And that's where they want to surround all global maternal health content. So it can be our editorial content, our blogger content, or their native content. But they don't want to be around abortion or birth control. So it's a manual oversight, and almost, like we on the business side sit and manually curate that content. So there's an opportunity there to be very, very, very clean and brand safe for
What about
for our
within
partners.
programmatic? I mean, that's one of the things that's been growing as a part of everyone's business. Is that something that is having an impact?
Yeah, so I sit less on the programmatic side, but I am going to assume that the same negative keyword targeting is in place. The problem is a lot of programmatic is across all the platforms that we were talking earlier about, ad serving, limitations. And I do think that that is something to be very, very, very aware of and conscious of in the programmatic landscape.
Say that programmatic is the pain point that keeps you up at night because it's the unknown coming through, or?
No, actually for me, programmatic isn't my pain point. We were talking earlier, we restructured our entire sales organization to focus on programmatic and premium content. Premium content is my world. And as putting on my publisher hat, whether it's a Huffington Post hat or an AOL hat, I want the best value for my media inventory. There's two ways to access consumers on the web. It's through digital placements, which I believe the future of all digital placements are going to be bought programmatically. And then there's premium storytelling, one-on-one conversations, which are through videos, long form, articles, blogs, etc. And so that kind of gets us out of the media banner space.
Yep.
So that's kind of where we see the future of buying and selling digital experiences.
How about you, Kevin?
Well, so I have a number of things that keep me up at night. I have 3 children under the age of 5 at home, so that's certainly, I have a lot of time up at night to think about all these things. But I think as it relates to the business, I think it really is an issue of getting the technology into a place where it's so crisp that there's a lot of confidence in what it can do so that you can focus on the more strategic issues that are impacting the business. And I know we've kind of covered that, but I really do think that's at the core of this issue. And I think the technology is getting much better. I think the technology is getting to the point where it's nice to have human beings that are looking at it. You should have technology targeting it. You should have third parties kind of thinking about also vetting it, especially within verticals like education, because within education there are legal constraints, right? Not just, oops, my ad spelled somewhere that it shouldn't have. So I think we really are working to kind of crack that problem. And once we do, I think the thing that I'd be thinking about as an educator right now is when I consider the schools that are out there and what they're doing, we spend a lot of time trying to crack this issue, right? So we spend a lot of manpower and energy trying to think about brand safety and where it's going to be. And a lot of ways, and a lot of schools will start to use that as a reason on why they're not promoting their schools or doing different ideas or innovating within the space. And I think we need to kind of flip that conversation a little bit and think about that not as a what's holding us back, but how do we approach it in the most transparent way possible in order to use that as a competitive advantage for the organization, right? So now what we perceive other organizations to be held back by, our school is using and bringing to market in the most authentic way possible, right? So I think that's really kind of what's at the core of the issue. But the first step is just getting the stuff out of the way, right? Because we need to begin to think about that problem. And right now we're just caught in this, am I gonna get dinged in the wrong area? What does that say about me? And all those things.
Are there particular verticals that keep you up at night, or they're
So outside of the children,
other than children?
The verticals, well, I'm in education.
Right.
So like education is core to what I do. I do look to other verticals as case studies and what are they doing, because I think there are some comps out there, and obviously finance is another highly regulated. Pharma, as it was mentioned before, is also another one.
Okay. Next question, Kevin Leaf. The internet and the digital marketing has changed a lot, and so how has if at all, have these environmental changes, how have they impacted you over the past few years? Have they made things easier or harder? And then how do you see these changes going forward impacting your world?
As far as, things have simultaneously gotten easier and more challenging. I think clients have really forced us to be more of a one-stop shop. So we did 6 acquisitions to become more one-stop beyond just search. But as far as from a technology perspective, the Googles and Bings and Yahoos of the world, they simultaneously giveth and taketh away with regards to additional targeting options, et cetera. Sometimes they take what previously were 2 buckets and decide it's really just 1 bucket, like tablets and desktops, for example. And even though many marketers, in particular larger scale marketers, would be able to fine-tune the experiences more, in particular before they got around to making everything adaptive. Again, it's sometimes it's easier, sometimes it's harder. There's an extra layer on there. I think also from the perspective of additional, let's call them bid multiplier functionality that exists both within programmatic display and within programmatic search, they're actually starting to look a little bit more like each other. We don't have RTB in search, but we're getting closer and closer to RTB in search. When you think about the RLSA and other functionality like that, I think the next big thing to watch ecosystem-wide across display, social, and search is going to be the level to which custom audiences are permitted and encouraged. On the one hand, you have researchers publishing studies that with 4 data points, they can identify that it's you, right? Even though it's none of them are your name or your social or anything. As long as they have IP address and 3 other data points, they can figure out it's you. And then on the flip side, you've got the amazing power of custom audiences driven off of a PII that then becomes anonymized. It's clearly been a huge success for Facebook, and pretty much everybody else has either launched a custom audiences product or has one in alpha, right? And that's because of the fact that suddenly email is vogue again, right? Because with an email address or a cell phone number, I can then create an audience of my most valuable customers. And I think that's where the big data, lies in this. So not really compliance per se, but because of the fact that a lot of it overlays with privacy and disclosure, there's going to be some activity here over the next couple of years, I think, both from a regulatory and technology perspective.
Got it. So I'm going to do a round robin question, but we're going to start with Chris, just to keep it from being so round robin. And I think we've touched on a little bit of this, each of you, but there's so many new formats that are coming out. You've got native, you've got social, and you've got programmatic, which is a more efficient way of addressing kind of the typical IAB standard units. And as we're seeing now, native and social are moving into programmatic. So, with all that in the past, I'd say it's 2 years that's really started to take off. Has that changed your approach to brand safety and brand compliance? It sounds like, Laura, you guys are doing a lot of hand curation in order to satisfy that. But what has changed from, let's say, 4 years ago when you were running, and it was probably more network-style buys, and people were doing kind of just bulk buys and then filling them with things that you didn't know? How have these native and social and programmatic channels kind of changed the way you look at brand safety, and it's changed the way that you look at compliance?
It's changed the way the brands react to engaging in social, because some of them are absolutely terrified and apoplectic because they see the negative stories in the past 2 years. Unfortunately, that bubbles up to the top. It's any sort of feedback from a restaurant worker that's doing something ridiculous and then posting it on social, to ad units that when they're showing up in an inappropriate place, getting a screen grab, and all of a sudden becomes a meme and it's on Reddit somewhere and it becomes part of our cultural vernacular that day. So that's the ridiculously extreme, dangerous point that we start with brands. And I think you made an interesting point about trying to allow the brands to feel a little bit more open and to kind of let it happen a little bit more. We are starting to see that the cultural shift is allowing CEOs, like we work with energy companies, who are saying, sure, we're willing to do a social media growth hack campaign, reach out to Brody Smith, who does a trick frisbee shot, and he'll be wearing the Barclays jersey because they power the electricity at the Barclays Center, but he's going to say the Blue Rock Energy tagline, power up, in a 6-second Vine video for $7,500. That would have never happened 2 years ago for an energy company. If I put that on the table for the energy company, it'd be like, get out, you're a quack. But now, because they're starting to see the good and the bad with it, they can allow for their brand to be caught up in a space that they would have never imagined 2 years ago, a year ago, sometimes even 6 months ago, where they're sort of loosening the screws on understanding that their brand identity isn't what they write down on a piece of paper internally or put up on a billboard or a whiteboard within the office, that it's really how the end user feels about the brand. And for them, for an energy company, it was about tapping into an audience that knows that they can have choice, knows that they can say, I want this energy provider versus that energy provider, so it makes perfect sense. Getting to that spot is an interesting journey, but it's changing. Like, people are opening up a lot.
We're seeing it change too, and I mean, I think to the point that's being made, what people are beginning to accept and realize is that their brand doesn't belong to them as much as it does the consumers of the product. And we've been saying this for a while, so like, this isn't groundbreaking news, but it turns out that it's true, and all companies are beginning to realize that. And that presents, though, all sorts of challenges for everyone in this room, right? Because there are very real compliance issues with that. So you need to figure out how to foster that conversation in the most positive way. And again, it goes back to that kind of focus on the user. And that's where it all starts, right? So I think that's all.
What? Oh, go ahead.
I was just saying, I almost feel like it's less about the ad formats that have changed and more about the social platforms that have launched. Because, I mean, we've both seen, I mean, whether it's Vine or Snapchat or, I mean, your brand is now, you mentioned earlier brands as publishers. We talk about that all the time. But even if you're not on those platforms yet, there are other consumers just talking about you, sharing photos, bad experiences, good experiences. So now all of a sudden, it's you need to be policing not just ad formats, but just the social, the social world in general. I think that's dramatically changed how brands think about messaging.
I think an interesting context to when you think about compliance as well as just what industry norms are. One of the ways I try to explain it to clients with regards to SEO, which obviously has a white hat, black hat, and a gray area in the middle, is, and this is true for social and to some extent even for display, which is it's sort of like speeding, right? When you guys head out from New York, whichever way you go, the chances that you stayed under 55 the entire time are pretty low, right? So you're all speeding, right? Because speeding gets you from point A to point B better, faster, right? And with almost every one of the media types we've been discussing, a certain amount of speeding will let you be the winner. But if you go beyond a certain point, all of a sudden there's like a logarithmic chart of how likely you are to get caught. So if you do 10 miles above the speed limit, 15, okay, you're pushing it 20, 25, 30, 40, all of a sudden your chance of getting caught goes up dramatically. So it's an appetite for risk conversation that you have to have internally from a strategic perspective. And sometimes it's a winner-take-all game. So it's a really tough conversation to have.
So I want to go back to something, Chris. You mentioned, you have energy clients that are now making Vines, and you're having them do Instagram things and things that you'd never see from a content creation standpoint, where they're willing to engage within the social format. But I want to treat kind of the content created by the advertiser as separable from the content that their ads are adjacent to. And talk to me about the rate of uptake between those two. So you do have brands that you would see as conservative now making more content, but still very conservative about its adjacency, or are you seeing an inline growth where they say I'm making the content and I'm not concerned with adjacency? Yeah. How is that balance working out, and what's the rate of change that you're seeing amongst brands that you would have never expected to participate in one or either or both?
Yeah, the bigger brands like Legendary Pictures that are very highly cognizant of where ads run and why they run and what type of movies they're making and the conversation around the movies are becoming more aware of not only creating their own content, but that growth hacking scenario that if it flops and if it's crap, somebody else created it and it's fine. Meaning that they'll commission somebody to create something that has a social ecosystem in order to get in front of that audience, and if it works, super. They'll take all the credit for it and then they run that as their ad unit. If it flops, that's just somebody talking about one of our movies. So it does allow for them to have a little bit of wiggle room and not necessarily take full responsibility for where the ad runs or what's exactly happening there. But it is always top of mind. It does also work off of user-generated content. So maybe the line in the sand is that it's not all being generated from the brand or even us creating it, that we sit back and kind of find a pocket of the combination between the brand-created content, our unique created content on behalf of the brand, and then the user-created content, but then there's the paid user content. And even if the user content works, we'll allow that to become an ad unit. We'll do on-site, on-the-ground content generation, have people sign off waiver forms saying, and people get excited about it, hey, you can become part of their social media buy. Awesome, I'm gonna give you a review when I leave the Legendary Pictures movie or the Saturday Night Live exhibition. We interview people as they're coming out of the exhibition in the gift shop. You might become part of their ad unit, so it completely removes themselves from not necessarily a responsibility, but maybe it is a responsibility, kind of allowing it to be all user-generated content.
Got it. So we're going to, last question, and before we do Q&A, I want to circle back to the concept of compliance. It sounds like all of you have different strategies, approaches, and you all come from different parts of the business, but are you using any kind of third-party compliance stuff, or are you doing it mostly in-house? I know that it's high touch and mostly hand done, but there is a programmatic channel. So, are you using a third party? What resources are you bringing to bear for compliance? And what do you then think is going to happen in, let's say, the next 5 years? So, what are you using for compliance today, whether it's third party or internal? And then, where do you see yourself in 5 years from a compliance and regulatory standpoint?
Who wants to start?
I'm happy. So I mean, most of ours is in-house, as everyone knows. Most of our partners are using a third party. If they're not, they probably should be, to help them. And then I think in 5 years, the technology is going to be so much better. It's the advancements in how we serve ads will also be better, but the technology and ensuring that everything's safe is going to be outstanding.
We use a combination of in-house and third-party. Obviously, within the pure search environment, trademark and IP-related issues tend to be something that requires a certain amount of compliance focus. As you move into the display realm and the paid social realm, we'll also use different third-party tools for that as well. I think it's impossible to be completely manual or to build stuff internally exclusively unless you have a really huge amount of extra tech team bandwidth. So that's why the third-party ecosystem is thriving right now.
Like Google, you have the extra bandwidth.
Yeah, we don't have anything internally. We rely on the brands to do that. But I think as time goes on, we're going to have to rely on a third-party source for it.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think ours is a combination of both. I think on the premium content side, we do a lot internally. We rely on the brands to power their own brand safety. And then on the programmatic side, we have some technology that allows us to do some of it. But we do access third party from a compliance perspective. And then I agree with you in regards to in 5 years, I think the technology is going to be so much better, and it's all about data.
Got it. All right, so thank you very much. I'd like to open up now to the floor and to questions. So if any of you have questions, I don't know if we have someone with a mic running around, but if we don't, just stand up, raise your hand, and someone will come to you. Any questions on this?
Oh, come on.
Come on, I know it was Ferris Bueller. I know it was the anniversary of Ferris Bueller last weekend, but you can, Bueller.
Hi, I'm Jess. I work at Unruly Media. We're a programmatic platform for social video advertising. I was just interested to understand from all of you where you feel the responsibility lies, because I thought it was interesting there that a couple of you said that you rely on the brands implementing their own brand safety. From our point of view, we often find that actually doesn't happen, and then the responsibility ends up going right up to the top to like the ad network. I'm just interested to understand whether all of your businesses feel like the responsibility needs to be pushed up or pushed down or remain with you, or what your thoughts are on that.
I would say, because I'm on the premium side, so on the native side, we co-create a lot of content with them, but they're going to know best from their legal side what is compliant, what is not compliant. So that's where On the premium native side, we really have to rely on their legalese, which is why they get the approval, the final approval process. On the programmatic and the display side, I kind of agree with you that if it's our pipes that are serving the ads, then we need to be the ones responsible for the safety of the delivered impression.
Can I add on to that question and say if you're working with a brand where it's incumbent upon the brand to do the moderation, do you have something contractually or do you insist that they are in line with compliance or are using a third party to make sure that you're not at risk? Just as an add-on
No,
to
but
that.
after this conversation, I should.
It's funny, I said that to Alex this morning.
Yeah, definitely.
I said it to Alex this morning as we were kind of preparing for this. I was thinking, I mean, I have a whole team of writers and editors, and we think about compliance and FTC regulation at the top, but I don't think our writers actually are aware of these types of issues. So I was just saying, I'm putting together kind of like a one-sheet rule compliance, just so our creators have insight as to the challenges that some of our partners, need to really think about. So I learned something from this. I'm very excited.
You do it all in-house, you don't...
Yeah, well, as it relates to the brands, right?
Yep.
So the technology, I mean, obviously the compliance is such a broad topic that we have third party, we have a lot of things going on, but as it relates to helping our brands, a lot of the things that we do are in-house. I'm not sure on the contractual obligations, to be honest. That's an interesting thing, and I think we do need to look at that. I think it's up to the brands. I think the point was made earlier to kind of outline their level of acceptance of risk, right? So they need to kind of come to the table and say, here's what we're interpreting and how much risk we're willing to accept, and then it's up to us to kind of provide the technology to target to our best of our ability within the parameters that are set. So maybe it's an out to the question, but I think it falls on everyone in terms of responsibility. But from a contractual standpoint, I got to look into that, to be honest.
Yeah, I don't remember if we have that included in our indemnification clauses or not, but I'll also go back and check just to be on the safe side. But I guess the point that I would make is that even within literally identical industries or identical different clients within the same industry, it's not uncommon that the interpretation of what's permissible and what isn't permissible is entirely different, right? So that's why it can't be the agency dictating to the client, oh, you're in the financial services industry. Hey, with geo-targeting, I think maybe that you're at risk if you target zip codes with wealth, because that might be who's to say? Because, again, if the competition's doing it and kicking your butt, right, there's going to be a certain amount of pressure to loosen guidelines. So it's really a conversation that has to happen within the entire ecosystem, right? It should be all the way up and down the stack, unless it's completely programmatic and it's just an algorithm deciding. Somebody still has to program the algorithm, right? What's acceptable, what's not acceptable.
Yep. Any other questions?
Hi, this question's for Chris. In regards to the Vine video that your energy client produced with the Frisbee trick shot, what was it successful?
They didn't produce it though, just to be clear. So we initiated the conversation, a gentleman by the name of Brody Smith. If you guys aren't familiar with him, check him out. He's a professional Frisbee player. I didn't know that was a thing.
All-team Frisbee?
But I didn't know you can make money from it. Yeah, it's like stoners play it. That's good. He does really incredible trick shots with Frisbees that are fun to watch on YouTube. He's got a huge ecosystem. He's got a ton of people following him on Vine. And our energy client came to us and said, we need something creative and unique, and we want to get in front of this demographic. And because they power the energy of the Barclays Center, we're like, all right, what can we do with basketball hoops? And one of our team members saw this guy doing a trick shot with a basketball hoop and a Frisbee, and we're like, that's perfect. We gave him parameters and guidelines. He executed it in his home state of Texas, sent us the product. We tweaked it a little bit, made sure that he was wearing a Brooklyn Nets jersey so that we can sort of co-op with the Brooklyn Nets and have Blue Rock Energy in there. And it was seen by 1.8 million people in the first 2 weeks for $7,500 in a 6-second Vine video. Blue Rock Energy was tagged. He does the Blue Rock Energy tagline in the Vine video, and he tagged the Barclays Center. And of course, they retweeted it. The NBA players got involved in it as well. So it was a huge success.
It's fascinating to see how where does the creativity lie? Right, in that instance, right? Because you guys sort of did the equivalent of a creative brief, but then empowered somebody else to sort of take it and run with it.
Yep.
Right, so creativity is not entirely owned by the agency. It's not entirely owned by anybody anymore. It's this collaboration that can occur, especially when you start to bring sort of the entertainers into it, right, and give them a little bit of leeway.
In storytelling, I mean, it is a perfect example of, there are so many creators out there in the world, whether they're YouTube influencers, Vine, I mean, and those are the people that are helping brands tell stories. And also in the native space, you're going to tell a story different on BuzzFeed than you're going to tell on Forbes. And BuzzFeed and Forbes are the people who know what those best stories look like. So is there even a need for an agency? It's, the whole landscape is in a huge shift right now. It's really interesting.
Cool. So we have about 2 minutes left. Do we have any more questions in the audience? Anyone for our panel? Bueller? No?
I actually have one quick question,
All right.
since I
There
have
you
the
go.
microphone in my hand. So a less fun question than that, but if any one of you guys can tell an example of something scary that you guys saw, and I mean, I know we have regulators and lawyers in the room, but something scary that you guys saw, maybe that was pulled down before it was up, and you're like, oh, I can't believe this was potentially going to be up there.
Yeah, the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society was running. There's a branch of the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society called Team in Training, and we were doing a full ad campaign, big media buy on Facebook, the morning of the Boston Marathon bombing. And all of the content was, marathoners embracing and being, joyously finishing and finish lines, and we timed it like that on purpose. We wanted to be part of that story. We wanted to be in the news feed as people were scrolling through, and what happens when you watch a marathon, you're like, I'm running a marathon next year, I'm doing this. So Team in Training wanted to get them to sign up and do good and donate to the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society as a nonprofit. And we had to have an appropriate chain of command, realize that the bombing happened. We wrote copy for them to come from the desk of the chief marketing officer, and within about 20 minutes, by having that process in place, it was approved. The initial ad units were all pulled down. The whole ad campaign was completely stopped, and it was just a letter from the chief marketing officer. So it was a potentially very scary thing, but we were able to address it.
Impressive.
So you do need agencies.
There you go. I'm not saying you don't. I'm not saying you don't.
What agencies do is just changing as a result
Yes.
of that. I mean, it's extra eyes on something. There's also, proof time and time again that when you have, extra brains working on something, not just distributing creative, but extra levels of compliance as well, there's less likely that stuff's going to hit the fan and somebody's going to get fired.
I think that's all the time we have. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for coming today.